Hey everyone, welcome back to my Q&A series. My name is John Michael Swift, and today I am answering a question one of my patrons asked. He was asking me about the song Slow Dancing in a Burning Room by John Mayer and saying, well, it sounds like he's playing the same three chords a lot of different ways the whole song. So I wanted to know, what are all the different ways you could play one chord? And it's a tricky question to answer because there are a lot of ways you could play one chord, and the big thing to remember is not all of them are equally useful. So what I'm going to try to do today is talk about all the ways that I know of to play one type of chord, but also to help you understand like how I kind of got to those things and what you might be the most useful for you to do. So let's kind of get right into it. There's four major systems that most guitarists use. There's lots of ones that are possible, but there's four major ones that I've seen the most. And I'm going to flesh all those out first of all, and then talk about weird stuff at the end. So the first system, main one, caged system. Everybody kind of knows this, but I'll give a quick run off of how I conceptualize it. You spell the word caged twice. C-A-G-E-D, 5 letters, 5 chords. There's a major version and a minor version. So you do your C major, A major, G major, E major, and D major. There's your major chords. And then you do the minor for the same thing. It's C minor, not very common, but technically it's there. A minor, very common. G minor, there, but also pretty rare. E minor, and D minor. And basically those comprise the easiest, kind of most natural, open position triad voicings on the guitar, and the ones that kind of cover as many strings as you can get. You can even expand those to, you can expand all the caged voicings to cover all 6 strings. You know, people use this D, F sharp, this D chord with this F sharp bass all the time. It's a 6-string D triad. You know, it's all the notes that you could do on all the strings of the guitar on the open position for a D chord. You know, super duper handy, and of course you learn to do bars with it. So if you you take an E chord, you start to move it up the neck. Now it's F, now it's G, etc., etc. That's where most guitarists start. Really handy, but 2 problems with it. One, a lot of times the chord voicings are a little unwieldy, especially the G at the beginning. It's a little hard to get started with because it's just hard to get your hands around. The other thing about it is that it's just blocky. Is that for the most part, it's kind of hard to get your hands to move around with it a lot because you're holding down a lot of notes, So learning how to do chord voicings that use fewer notes, very useful. I mean, eventually we'll talk about how to play chords with 2 notes, but I'm going to start with what I think is the next system to go to, which is the Triad System. I did a whole series on this because I just think it's the greatest thing. All the caged chords are triads. They're 3-note chords, and you just kind of stack up extra notes until you've covered all the strings. With the Triad System, you do what's called a closed position triad, where you just have 3 notes. They're as close together as they can be, and you do them on consecutive strings. And what I do is I'll usually take a scale I'm working with, like if we started with like a G chord, and you play your caged G chord, great. Well, now you can get a dozen other ways to play a G chord. I guess 9 other ways. So let me check. I'm going to figure out how many other ways you can play a G chord with the Triad System. So you've got 3 sets of strings, which are going to give you different kind of inversions of the chord, slightly different tone color. But you can also turn the chord on its head 3 times. You can put each of the 3 notes on the bottom, and that'll change the other 2 top notes. And there's really only one way to do them. So basically, if I took a G chord up here and put G in the bass, here's a root position G chord. There's one with D in the bass. There's one with B in the bass. So there's 3 on your thinnest 3 strings. If you go to the next set of strings, there's one inversion, there's another inversion, there's another inversion. Some of those have the same notes as the sets on the other strings, but they sound a little different because of where they are on the neck, which strings they're on, all that stuff. And then you can do the same thing. Let's see, where would the G be here? Yeah, there we go. There's one inversion. There's another one, and then there's another one. So there's 3 more there, and I suppose technically there's some more down here. I don't tend to focus on those ones as like a different thing, because the tone color is different, but the shapes are actually the same as what you would get on these 3 strings. All the bass strings are going to have the same shapes. Your treble strings, you have to learn different shapes for them. But basically, if you learn to harmonize a scale, like take a major scale and you say, okay, G is the 1, A minor is the 2, B is the 3, C is the 4, D is the 5. It seems a little weird at first, but you eventually start to realize there's not that much to do. There's really only 7 chords in a scale, and there's really only 3 kinds of them. You know, you've got your major kind, your minor kind, and your diminished kind. And you only got to learn those 3 shapes and then kind of learn how to shuffle them around in a key, and then you've kind of learned the triad system. And that frees your hand up so much. These chord voicings move around so much more easily than cage chords. I mean, I used to write this thing. That's like a little doodle I used to do because I just liked how easy it was to move the triads around. It's just great. You can kind of play around them fairly easily, and you can just move the chord voicings easily. It's much freer than the cage system. But of course, sometimes you want things that are not just triads because, well, just triads get a little flat. So when you add a note to a triad, you get a 7th chord. It's a 4-note chord. And you take kind of a similar mathematical approach when you use kind of the standard, I guess, the 4-note jazz system that a lot of guitarists use. Well, you basically say, there's 4 notes of the chord, let's do it in all the inversions. And generally you try to keep the 3 top notes kind of close together, but then you have the bass note somewhere, and you think of all the string combinations and all the inversions, you could generate those in. So this is a exercise that has a lot of chords in it, many more so than the last one, even in the triads. But lots of fun. The chord voicings sound really cool. So like to give you an example of just one of these, if I took the key of F, I'm going to do my root and the bass. I'm going to keep all my roots on my thick E string, and then I'm going to take the D, the G, and the B strings and put the other 3 notes of the chord there. So that's my root position F triad. If I do the 2 chord in that key, it's G minor, so I gotta use my minor shape. 3 is another minor shape too. I go back to the major 7 shape for the 4 chord. Gotta use the dominant shape now. So gotta learn more chord voicings for this, but they're nice ones. So there's my dominant, use my minor 6 again. My half diminished is on the 7, and then the 1 up here again. So you kind of learn, you kind of get these kind of little... You can still do a lot around those, and they have a much kind of nicer sound than a lot of the kind of like the really blocky caged voicings. Now the other thing at this point though, you start to get to this idea of like if you're going to play jazz, a lot of times you don't play chords with either roots or fifths in them. It's very common for a jazz guitarist to play what's called rootless voicings, especially when you get more into modern jazz. It just gives it kind of a more interesting sound. But even if you're playing solo guitar, and you might still need to play your root, a lot of times people like to drop the 5th. So this is where we're going to start to explore the idea of extensions on a chord system. You can do this with any of the chord systems. You can even go back to cage and say, well, I got a G chord. Well, how do I make it like a G7, you know? You kind of like base it off of a G chord, but you kind of take this note and you lower it to get your G7 chord. You can do that with any chord you want. Say, well, what are kind of the notes around the notes that I have? And you tend to try to stay in the key, but you don't necessarily have to. But you start to get other things. Like if you go into triads, what I tend to do is I tend to try to figure out, okay, what are all the notes that I could use in the scale that actually don't make another triad? Because if I'm in this G here, and I add this note, well, that's just another triad. That's just an E minor. If I add this note, not so much. It's not technically a triad. It's like an add 9 chord, which is kind of neat, Another one, I think one I favor a little bit more is either this one. That's kind of the sus4. It's like you took a triad, but you like kind of put that 4th in there instead of the 3rd. I really like the sound of that, So you find a lot of cool little gems like that when you mess around with the triads. And part of the way you can find that almost is just like trying to play solos around the triads. You can even just be strumming and just find other notes. Look up both above and below the shape. You can look at all the strings. So that's a really fun thing to mess around with. And by the time you get into the jazz chord exercise, this is almost mandatory. It's really good to learn these chord scales as a skeleton. But frequently, I mean, if you're going out and playing with real jazz cats, they don't really want to hear that. It's too buttery. So one of the easiest ways to do that is, you know, take a chord voicing you're doing, you know, take this A minor 7 right here, really common, really good to play around. But you know, you got a 5th here. It's a butter note, you know. So how do you change it? Well, let's lower it 1. Look at that. Now I got an 11 chord, which is a lot neater than that before. Kind of use the open strings a bit, you can still kind of get a lot of freedom and be able to move your hands fairly freely doing all that stuff, which is great. But speaking of open strings, let me talk about the last system real quick. And it's funny because this is, I mean, this isn't so much a system as kind of an organic discovery of people. This is what I would call the open chord voicing system, and really you kind of got to let this be its own beast. All the other systems, it's very useful to kind of approach them mathematically and memorize them in an ordered fashion because it helps you understand the theory and the sound of what you're doing. It helps you remember stuff because you have it in a logical order. That's all really good stuff. But when you get to open strings, like the chemistry of how they work is so particular to the key and the chords you are using that you kind of throw it out the window and you just play with it, which is why a lot of people like this, because it's just more organic. But I mean, the way a lot of people kind of discover this is really, I mean, again, you discover this stuff through songs. There's tons of songs that use open chord structures, and there's like really common open chord tropes in lots of different types of songs. Like, I mean, a couple of my favorites are like, you know, if you took Blackbird. I mean, basically what you're doing is you're using your D and your G strings as kind of open strings, but you're playing tenths. You're playing, you know, you're implying your chords through 2 notes played around those. So it kind of grounds it in the key, but it lets you create all kinds of neat chords. I mean, this, you know, this song uses all kinds of chromatic chords. I mean, you know, there's a B flat in the key of G, there's an F in the key of G, there's a C minor in the key of G. You know, so there's chords that are in the key, but also chords that are outside of the key. And you get them fairly easily and get a lot of color out of them. You know, and the thing is, Blackbird is not the only song that uses that idea. You know, like what was the other one? You know, Fast Car by Tracy Chapman saying, you know, you got a fast car, I wanna take you to anywhere. You know, same chord voicings basically. And so that basic idea, I mean, I've discovered a ton of songs that use that. There's some Frank Turner songs that use it. So I call that the open G box. And the way I think of it is, okay, you got 2 open strings here. You got a D and a G, but then you kind of play with different intervals on the A and the B strings, you know, or other strings around it, but those are mainly the ones that people do. And, you know, you find all kinds of your own cool things. You mix finger picking patterns or strumming or whatever techniques you're into over it, and all kinds of neat things happen just by messing around with it. And I mean, I am going to do a whole series on that. You know, maybe by the time you see this video, I will have done one. Aha. But at this point, I haven't. But I really want to, because there's so many songs that are just, you know, like the E box is another one. Like this kind of whole this kind of a fusion of the triad chord scale. If you take the kind of E second inversion triad chord scale based on the A string, it actually makes a really common box that kind of gets used for creating open string chord progressions for songs. It gets used all the time. If you're not thinking of like 3 songs that sounds like, you know, then, you know, you haven't been out much. So that's a whole system of itself. But a lot of that has to do with just this basic idea of saying, okay, check me out. I got some open strings. I'm going to play notes on some of the strings and not really play notes on these certain drone strings that kind of ground what you're doing, and you kind of let your finger patterns reflect through that and see what comes of it, which is oodles of fun. Of course, you can learn through songs. There's tons of songs that use this, but you can also invent your own fairly easily, which is a lot of fun. All I got to do is like pick an open string or even retune an open string and just pick 2 strings and play notes around it. And when you find chords that sound cool, you keep them, and eventually you build up a bunch of chords that sound cool together. So those are the 4 major systems that I have discovered for chord voicings. You know, you've got your caged, you've got your triads, you've got your jazz sevenths, and you've got open string voicings. Now, at this point, you start to go off the beaten path a little bit, but there's a lot of other cool stuff out there. And I mean, let me just talk a little bit about reasons why you might want to use different kinds of chord voicings. The biggest reason is to control dynamics. Is that, you know, when you're doing a big cage chord and you're strumming, it's a real big sound. That's your big sound. When you're like, you know, finger picking 2 notes or 3 notes, you know, that's your little sound. You know, if you're just strumming 3 notes, you know, kind of in the middle. You know, all these things are different ways of controlling how much sound, and especially when you're a guitarist in either like a small ensemble or by yourself, you really need all these different chord voicings to, you know, not only get a lot of interesting things out of what your fingers can do, but also to create all the sense of like, oh, there's a band now. Oh, oh, now it's really little. Now it's just him. That's how you create the dynamics, you know. So, I mean, a song I really like to do this with is Jack and Diane. I've done this a ton, where it's like I'll start out with an open chord voicing. It's real big. So I'm kind of half using just 2 notes there. It's like this is really just, I'm using just those dyads. Just 2 notes against the open strings, but yeah, I got my A, my B, and my E, which make a really nice kind of open string combination. You know, that works really, really well for that song. And then later you can kind of go, you know, that's a totally different sound, even that. When you want it to get really small, I'll often just like stick to these little triads down here, you know. It's like almost a little version of caged. But in a way, it's kind of like the kind of crossover of caged and triads there. But that's my kind of like little sound for that. So, you know, one song, when I got to do, you know, like a whole band arrangement, really kind of carry the energy and the dynamics of a really grand song like that by myself, these chord voicings really just kind of run the whole thing. So, anyway. There's a thought for you there. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is kind of going off the grid a little bit. So, I mean, you know, when you start to really invent your own stuff, I mean, everyone's got their own way of doing it. Some people just change the tuning and just let their hands do stuff. I mean, for me personally, I like to have kind of systematic ways of exploring things because it keeps me from getting kind of creative blocks. So what I tend to do is tend to kind of look at the math of how certain chord systems are generated and kind of tweak with them a little bit. So, I mean, I think my favorite discovery, I'll just show you one of my favorite personal discoveries that I've used a lot, and I'll explain to you how I got to it. So, you know, let's say you take triads or whatever, you go to the Triad System, you're like, well, these are all closed position triads. Why do they have to be closed position triads? Why don't we throw a note somewhere else and see what you get? So, you know, if I take this G here and I throw it down here instead, that's kind of neat and stuff, but I mean, I don't know. It doesn't have kind of like the puissance that I want quite yet. So, you know, and then I might take, okay, what if I just took those 2 notes and put them there? Well, it's not a triad anymore, so I kind of reshuffled it, and eventually discovered these like sort of inverted triad voicings where it's like you have some kind of bass note on your thick E string, but you do the other 2 notes of the triad on your D and your G strings. And I've just found, like, for me, you know, putting that with open strings together, oh my gosh, it just makes my favorite voicings. Because this is where you really start to sound your own. So, I mean, I'll play a riff from a song that I wrote, and, you know, the song's called Little Boat. It goes like this. Then one day it hit me, and I broke down and cried. I forgot the only thing that was keeping me alive. My candle's just a flicker now. My rope is at its end, but love's the only thing that hasn't left me for dead. And it goes back out of that's the bridge there, goes back to the rest of the song. So the main thing that's going on there in terms of the voicing is I'm using different inversions of triads, but I've got the voicing a little spread out. I've got a bass note here, and then I've got my other two notes on those strings. And so it's like, with this voicing though, I've got my bass there, I got an E, I guess that's the B, and there's the G sharp right there. So that's technically the chord right there, and I got two open strings there. It just, I don't know, it just sounds different, which is neat. And it's really, again, these are easy to move around just like the other triads. So I can just kind of slide these down. I got an inverted B chord, I just slide that down two frets. I got another chord, I move one note, got my minor, and I still got my open strings working for me, so I just slide those voicings around a lot, and I still get, that kind of play of major and minor and chromatic chords that I want. It's really easy to just finger pick through different things. I really was excited when I discovered that. Whenever I was doing all the listener effect stuff originally, I wrote a couple of songs that really focused on those chord voicings because they really just kind of hit me in the feels. So, but that just kind of came from taking triads and moving the notes around and making non-closed position triads. And there's all kinds of ways to do that. Now, the other thing you should bear in mind is that, any combinations of anything are allowed. It's more of a question of how do you actually use what you're going to use. And it's if you want to stay on the beaten path, it really is good to kind of start with learning songs that you're going to want to do, because those kind of ground you, and then kind of doing the exercises around them maybe to expand your possibilities. That's really great, and that's a way to kind of keep yourself grounded. When you want to be a little more original and you want to focus on doing more of your own thing, start with just the exercises and play with them a bit. So, there's no law saying, oh gosh, you have to play at least 3 notes. You don't. You can just, a lot of what you can do is just, you can do a lot with intervals. You can do a lot with 2 notes. Like, what happens if I just play, people, doing just 2 notes on any combination of strings, Why can't you just do octaves on the 2 outer strings? Why can't you do, tenths on the outer 2 strings? Maybe you like that for some reason. That's solid. The question is, what do you want to do? When you're using a guitar that has a lot of gain on it, or you're playing with a lot of other people, you tend to want to use smaller sounds. A lot of times when I'm playing in bands, I'm just doing I'm just playing, dyads. I'm playing 2 notes most of the time, because even triads are just a little too thick. But a lot of times when I'm by myself, I'll mix, my kind of little strummy stuff. My kind of really big, my bigger strumming stuff. And that's really how you get your dynamics in your solo guitar. So again, to kind of summarize the whole discussion, there's 4 common systems. You got caged, you got triads, you got jazz 7th chords, and you've got open string voicings. You can, of course, tweak any number of those things. You can add notes in, you can take notes out, you can take notes you don't like and change them to notes that are kind of nearby the main chords you're doing. You can switch which strings things are voiced on. Some people do even weird systems where they just look at shapes. They're like, let's just do triangles. Obviously don't do this a lot, but you can just look at your fingers and be like, triangles. Go for it, any way you want to approach it. But the way I approach it is, it's good and systematic, and you can really get a handle on the sound and where you are development-wise in your guitar playing, and you can apply all these voicings to a lot of stuff really easily, because all those voicings get used in real music, and I try to explain what songs I see them all getting used in as we go. But yeah, keep digging into this series, because you're going to see, all those voicings show up in different songs that we do in the Songwriters Grooves project and lots of other projects I do. So keep your eyes peeled for them, and feel free to ask more questions if you have them in the future. But otherwise, peace out, folks. Keep playing guitar.